This past week, my daughter, who's a writer, brought a book of essays that she just picked up recently um, to the door, to my attention at any rate, and I insisted on grabbing the book from her. But it was from a guy named Roman Jacobson. He's a linguist, but he had a chapter. I mean, most of his writing, obviously, is about words and that sort of thing. But it had a chapter on called "What is Realism," and in that chapter, he delves into realism in relation to the arts. So I was already thinking about this subject, and I'm planning to do a little bit of an essay, just something short, for one of our blogs one day. Where's my voice today? And but I mean to uh, give this first run through with a bunch of pictures in mind, and just talk about realism in the various ways it's been you know thought of in our time, used in our time. We are in an age of a new realism, so to speak. I mean, in other words, uh, not just a new age for representational painting, but there's this movement back toward a thing called realism, if it's the one that this one is talking about. So let me get back to first by thanking David, David DRA. David, thank you very much for that really kind, ongoing donation. That's really helpful. And so, yeah, really helpful. So I apologize. I'm going to be distracted a little bit today, and it's just going to be the way it is. I've injured my knee, and I'm in a little bit of pain. So I say that I'm not trying to get commiserations, but I may lose a few nouns here and there today. It's more than usual. Let's put it that way. So let's have a look. This what the comments were from this book on realism by Roman Jacobson. Uh, um, is who, by the way, wound up, I think, doing his whatever professorial work at the New School in New York, which I think at some point is described as an anarchist school. So maybe some of all this realism stuff fits in different ways, but it doesn't have anything to do with his subject. Is just simply to try to analyze the word realism. And but one of the points he makes is that all over the board are people who claim to be realists, the futurists, the Dadaists. They're all realists, right? So realism takes on all sorts of new, profound other meanings. He mentions Dostoevsky calling himself a higher realist, right? Um, but he draws attention particularly to this guy Kramskoy, and Kramskoy describes justifications for deviating from some of the norms of the what you think of as the forms of the academic era that he was in. And he would have been a student of the Russian Imperial Academy, um, that everybody was practically at that time. I think Repin had definite connections to it, and so on. But what's interesting, so here's an image or two by of Kramsky's work. What you're seeing here is the sort of the nth degree of noodling in a picture, and this is Kramskoy leads what people think of as the Russian school of realism, and he describes himself as a realist. And you'll see in the next couple of pictures I show you of his how he defines the word. You can get a much closer idea, but it's much more closely aligned around two things in painting, and I'm going to tell you to use your eyes when you're trying to understand what I'm saying with these things. But two things. One is the sheer noodling up of every little thing, like lots of hairs, individual hairs, and that sort of thing. To the trying to make the thing look 3D, like getting it so it's more real, like more tangible, like more there, more actual. Of course, that whole discussion about the actual versus the visual is a big one that comes along as we go along here. So there's a couple of his works. The painter on the left, I think it might be Shishkin, who I'll mention for my Russian friends. I'm a fan of Repin, Shishkin, Kramskoy. But this here is like as modern, this is like today's painting by so many of our young realists, the guys who are working in the studios or in their early days in their own studios. I meant to say in the schools. And and you can see what it is, though. It's that very bean count of every little thing in every possible way. So there's, and I want you to just observe a picture like this, though, and just notice where your eye goes and what you start thinking about, right? I mean, it begins to be a picture of how did he do that with paintbrushes, right? You've lost sight, for me at least, I completely have lost sight of the guy that he might be. What, is he a tramp? No, or something. He's got those horse things, so maybe he works in the stalls. What is he? Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, by the way, he painted portraits of models regularly, much like Rembrandt did. He had models and he painted their heads over and over again. And all of his work isn't precisely like this, but this is pushing one of the ideas that's associated with realism, that is every little bump. And some, in the old days, they would say all the warts, right? Well, all the warts starts meaning things other, right? When you talk about all the warts, you're now talking about possibly all the problems with society and literally all the bumps on a person's face. And you look for the bumpiest guy to make, deliver all that stuff. It does. I find personally, I find it becomes an attraction all of its own. It's just about performance attraction, much like big fluffy brushstrokes. Noodling things up to the nth degree has this curious attraction, but I think it's a significant distraction from the narrative or from the elements of beauty that underlie all painting, right? Now this is a Repin, and I apologize for not putting words on. I was a little short of time. All these pictures, so you'll have to be paying attention. But this Repin was said to be not realistic enough. It was entered into a show. I don't know if it was a salon or what it was. But the comment about this picture was how it wasn't realistic. It wasn't realistic enough. And so what in the world did they mean by realism at the Academy at that point? So it's a very interesting thing. Did they mean that every little facet of everything was noodled up? Now, if you look at this thing closely, you might see a few suggested lines, but it looks like really everything really is virtually noodled up. And it's certainly realism in the sense of blood on the guy's head and just murdered by his father and all the rest of the stuff. So what's your definition of realism, right? And maybe we could treat this, instead of maybe calling it what is realism, we could call it what is your definition of realism? What is realism to you? One of the things I'm talking about this for, and even inclined to talk about it for, is because of the idea of the classical realist guys. What is that realism? But did they mean, in fact, classical representational painting? Or did they mean realism, which has all these other stuff? And you'll see more stuff what I mean. So that's something to think about. What do we mean by realism? And do people in general, when you're speaking and you say realism, do you just simply mean representational painting? Because realism has got these interesting warts of its own, shall we say. And it sort of begins with these two. These, again, both by Kramskoy. The top one of Christ, and then if you look closely at it, you can see every tiny little rock modeled up. It's quite a remarkable feat, in an interesting thing, not dissimilar in some ways from what academic work was doing, but easier maybe to see the bottom one. The bottom one is nymphs or something. I forget what they call it. What were they? It looks like angels or whatever, but there's some water connection here and so on. But if you look closely at that, one of the things, you might take the time on your own to look more closely at these things if you can't bring them in close now. But just look at these. There's no part of this picture that isn't real, that isn't resolved as if you could touch it, like even the trees in the distance. You could walk around everything. Everything is counted. Every little stem and every branch is counted and accounted for with conscientious drawing. And so I'm talking about this with the idea of saying that one of the sides of one of the definitions of realism is this sort of thing where everything is tangible. You've fully resolved everything to be an actual object, the very most you could possibly do to make it come forward and turn into an object. And that, of course, brings us to the problem of Tromp. The Tromp full of the eye painting. The precedent for that, or even, was he painting roughly the same time? I think he was painting about the same time as Kramskoy. This is Alma Tadema. But you can see that Alma Tadema, everything is looked into, as it were. Everything is noodled up in very fine ways. every little particle of this thing in very much the same way. And he has a whole world of painting. We all, when we were young, actually admired greatly and wondered about it. You'd say we looked at it and wonder because of that, of course, that wonderful quality of articulation, the modeling, the fine modeling of every little thing, the marbleizing of the marble and all that sort of stuff, and the detail on the architecture. But so Alma Tadema represents that in sort of the quasi-academic world. But academics don't typically do that. But I'm going to jump over if I can. So here's a Leighton. This is much more typical of what an academic painter would have done, as it were, realistically, right? But not realistically in the sense of all the warts are making it look like a slice of today's life. He's obviously painting a Greek theme, and there's a certain kind of broad modeling and all that sort of stuff that goes with that. Harking back to the modeling of Greek sculpture, but there's a tremendous simplicity to his work here. And the argument against Repin's work being realistic might have been that it wasn't like this, right? So that's one of the arguments made by Jacobson, is that if you're in the academy and this is your definition of a realistic painting, or then you'd be expecting this, and you wouldn't know what that other stuff was, right? But that, and just to put that in a perspective, that's what the other the more typical academic would have been trained to do. Very broadly expressed forms, very simplified, and following any number of academic classic norms, classic meaning commonplace norms for them. But the realist sort of begins to change things. In fact, one of the things that I should mention is when I was a student in New York, the Ashcan School, which was dominated by a form of realism, which is sort of street art, and I think I have one of those here. I'll show you it as time goes by. But at the time, I was a student of Daniel Green's for a while, and in his classes, he said he decided that the way he was going to differentiate himself was by digging in on the drawing. So where drawing had been loose, broadly expressed, and really kind of bad, actually, in New York in that time. I'm thinking of the Sawyer brothers, surprisingly weak from the point of view of people teaching in institutions, at least unless you're trying to teach something else, which of course is a different discussion. But the idea of digging in on the noodling was his idea of doing something different. And I think that realism is a kind of a, doing drawing, but being able to draw more detail, suddenly has, became sort of an emergent piece of it, right? And you remember, even when you're speaking with Gemmell or reading some of the books, maybe even some of the comments of Kenyon Cox, you'll find that all the studios were invested in getting students to paint exactly what they saw in front of them. It was never not there. So in one sense, if you want to call that realism, but then at a certain point myself, for example, I had to make a decision because I found that tedious as heck. I didn't find it was accomplishing any aesthetic mission. The stuff I visually responded to was being obliterated in some ways by the realism. In other words, I was just getting a photo by the time I got done with a particular piece. And it, and I don't mean to say that in a too, blunt a way, too negative a way. But let's go back anyway. Let's do some other stuff. But I'm just saying it's one of the common threads, as a student. You're going to dig in on this or that. And I remember as a student, by the way, feeling how horribly daunting the whole idea of getting decent drawing was. In the background I came from, and then even the art students, like training, it was remarkably weak at giving you the underpinnings. But the realist movement might be, a lot of people attribute it to Courbet. You could go back, I think, to Goya and people like that, but in a different way, though. But when you get to Courbet, and there's some conversation that sort of goes socialist on you there. And well, Kremskoy may have been, I don't remember what he was. I know Repin was sort of chased out by Stalin, was chased out of Russia, but or not allowed back, whatever. But um, but the socialist realist thing, which is the other realism, but to the side of realism. Now it doesn't have to be socialist realism, but there's the realism of the. Wonder if I can pull up the Degas quickly, if I even have it here. So when you're looking at these two here, this is the bottom one is John Sloan, one of the New York Ashcan painters in New York, and undoubtedly one of the influences on the Raphael brothers. The Sawyer brothers I just spoke of. I think may have said Raphael. It's the Sawyer brothers. But but that realism here is a grungy looking thing, and no, it's purposely their version of making it look like the street or looking like it's real is to bunch people up and give them unpleasant faces, just like it might have been on the beach. No particular aesthetic except trying to show realism, okay, trying the truth of what might have been on the beach. The other realism, the novels in France, I'm thinking Zola, but I'm thinking I've also not read enough of any of these guys to be able to corroborate that, although the influence was there with Degas. But in this Degas, he's painting what you might call realism. He's showing like a fight between a man and a woman. Like they're having butting heads over who gets the car tonight or something, or, who gets the kids. That realism, right? So that's subject realism. On the other hand, the drawing, this drawing is classic drawing, right? So Degas is doing what was fairly typical, more or less academic drawing from outlines, modeling a form. There's a passage here sometime you all may want to look at. It's very, very painterly in the sense of a sergeant or something like that. And very much visual order, lost and found, that sort of thing. Very interesting little passage here. You see him going in and out of that all the time as time goes by. That's a very interesting discussion we've had in other videos. But let me take us back to, so then there was the realism that was attributed, the Courbet realism, which was very much about showing men working and not queens and kings and, and all other, dream scenes, which, the sort of what we call today the Disney mentality. Or maybe not exactly today, but here's the Gleaners by Millet, and he denied any interest whatever in socialist realism. They were trying to take credit for him and that he was struggling for the workers and all these sorts of things. He said he wasn't, and he said he had no interest. He actually was admiring the workers, and he portrayed work. It was practically the very description of the body of his work is the work of man, And he did it like Virgil or somebody would do it, the poet. Virgil, who was one of his favorite poets. But he does it in this ennobling way. It's not piling them on the beach and making them look miserable. So the groupings and all those sort of things wind up being much more along classical lines. One of the questions, by the way, that also came up in the essay, the Jacobson essay. Again, that essay is called What is Realism? And that's Roman Jacobson. But, and I bet you can find those online. Those are all written a long time ago. I think the guy was born very close to where Gemmell was born, this guy, Roman Jacobson. He comes out of Czechoslovakia, I think. But what was I going to say? Oh, I lost that line. I had two images in mind. Oh, Delacroix and Delaroche. So Delaroche, Millet was a student of Delaroche, and Delacroix was like Ang. Ang would just cover his eyes whenever he came near Delacroix. He thought it was poison or nasty or something. Something really turned him off about it. And he had a student, Cesario, who actually sort of seemed to want to hang around a little bit with Ang, and then hang around a little bit with in the mindset or way of Delacroix. And but there was this big discussion about who was the real realist. Was it Delacroix or was it Delaroche? Therefore, was it the academic who drew more accurately, or was it the guy who was actually suggesting some other kind of realism? And so that's the crazy problem that you have with realism. What the heck do we even mean by it? So let me go back to where I was. I think I'm going to get completely lost. So in this one here, I wanted you just to make sure you take a nice look at it and make sure the bottom one. And make sure that you watch what happens with your eyes and your mind. What does your thinking become? What do you become interested in? And does it wind up, as so much realism does, in rather a bean counting thing? Did we get all the girls with their faces turned right and polished up so they look real in 3D and all that sort of stuff? And it begins to be an exercise in, I don't want to say showing off. I don't think that's right. If you believe in realism, you're doing it for a very different reason. And that's, you want to make a scene like this that might be a mythological scene. You want to make it seem real, like it's plausible. And in some way, every painter, of course, is interested in that. Here's Bouguereau doing the same kind of thing. So this is the academic, the jump over to the academic. Here he's painting figures outdoors. I guess I don't see, there is apparently some water there, but it's oddly depicted. And, instead of drawing trees to feel solid and three-dimensional and all that sort of thing, he's using them as simple backdrop and painting a leaf or two here or there. You see a difference in the making of those two kinds of pictures. But in the end, Bouguereau has that thing about, even though he's rather idealizing the figure, he's still doing what we call a realistic treatment, and that is to say, realistic in the sense of full modeling and accurate and all those sorts of things. But you can see that there's a significant difference. If you said you're painting the model, these figures don't look like the model, they're rather idealized, right? And idealization and realism really aren't the same world at all, right? And then there's this one. This is the last Kramskoy, I think, that I have to show you. But in this one here, I'm so wholly staggered at this, at the realism in this picture. I mean, like everything in there you can reach over and touch, and you'd be rather inclined to maybe, unless it looked like something poisonous or something. But again, this becomes, watch where you're going. This is one of those things that becomes like the model. And this isn't anything, everything I've done today and everything I will continue to do is not to put a spin on whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But I want you just to be aware of what happens to your eyes, and then notice what other paintings, like this one, how differently you react, no matter what you look at. You're not lost in the stuff per stuff, in the sort of real world. You're in the world that he wants you to be in, which is the world of six figures. But so this is Velasquez, one of the, even at this point, you're seeing him as good a draftsman as you'll see in that, but significantly in that academic mold that reduces the forms, doesn't model everything by the detail from the inside out and all that sort of thing. And you wind up in a very different place. So the great forms, the great relationships, all those sorts of things are different. The whole modeling mentality is different. One of the things I like about this idea of modeling figures and not putting in every wart is that they become more like symbols of man, or useful to communicate to man. Whereas so many of those pictures, when you're using the realistic model, it has to be literally somebody. It looks like Mrs. So-and-so or something, in each of these things you can find the actual faces, but I find that a distraction when you're doing a storytelling picture, to actually have a model show up and you say, oh, I wonder how long that model, I mean, you might find yourself saying that, I wonder how long that model had to hold that pose. I'm just showing you Ang on the right and see how different that is. And his model, his sort of ideal was Raphael, and so the Raphael portrait on the left, and you can certainly see a bunch of noodling, I mean serious noodling in places like the dress here. And fineness in lots of places in terms of the articulation of things. This definitely is a movement toward a grander, simplified shape beauty world, shape beauty, line beauty, form beauty world. And it does look in numbers of the pictures by Raphael that Raphael was in sort of a bridge. And I'd like to say there's like a razor's edge again, and we're always at this point of divergence. Every painter is rather deciding all the time. If he's a representational painter, you always are living in this place about, at least for some period until you know who you are, you're living in this place of indecision between literally painting what's in front of you and what's that, or in the case of the Raphael, painting somebody of importance or a figure of history or the spirit, So, and then you'd find that some of your treatment of the model looking like so-and-so instead of looking like your ideal would be would be necessary. You'd have to start treating the model under the broader lines of the model. And I think that's where a lot of that may come from, which is what we call idealization. Anytime a painter like Ang starts doing Greeks, he starts making them look like their bodies are made out of Greek sculptures, but would have been modeled on a Greek piece of Greek sculpture. And that's true to some serious degree of Leighton as well. So that's an idea. You're treating a model with that kind of an idea. But in the case of Ang here, I'm going to say that even though his pictures, and he said, all I'm trying to do is make it just exactly like, what do you think I'm doing here? As a very funny and interesting long discussion with these people. That's what I said, everybody's sort of rather thinking that. And then people would say, yeah, you got to be kidding, right? And but his very simplified treatment and just the pleasure he gets out of the great flow and interplay of forms and lines tells you what the aesthetic was, right? And if this guy started copying all the warts, you'd never see the beauty of these great lines. That's the kind of thing, and that's where you start having the conversation about the aesthetic. So what are you doing in a picture, right? What's your idea? Yeah, I mentioned this before, but I didn't bring you back to them. But Rembrandt is really like with these guys. Yeah, I'd suggest you, and if you look at that bottom one close up, I would suggest you, he's like the patron saint of Kramskoy, the father figure or whatever you want to call it. But I'm just mentioning that you always find that there's another element. He doesn't actually make it look like he's the model standing in the room. For some reason, the ones by Rembrandt are always slightly in a different place. Could be the handling that's less real about certain aspects of it. Who knows? And then the treatment, I'm showing you just some various portraitists, but the treatment by Titian of the Englishman, I think it's an English noble or whatever, and again, it has, you'll see this, now notice exactly what your mind and I do when you look at a very realistic picture, all the hairs and everything, and when you look at one like this. This is drawn along what we call broader lines, right? And its intention isn't realism. It isn't making him realistic in the sense of being tangible, number one, and being so literally this guy that you've counted every bump on him and noodled every dinky little piece. These guys aren't immune from good modeling. Titian is, he does beautiful work here. This is one of the great portraits of all time. And then, of course, Velasquez, before we look at what Velasquez then becomes, but this Velasquez is really a nice example. It was one of my favorites from the Hispanic Society, and it's one of my favorites I've actually seen in person. Although I've seen there's a really delightful one out in the Armor Bearer or whatever he is out there in Chicago. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, and it lives in this place. But you can see the liveness, the living sense. So why is he painting differently, right? And so some people would say that this sense of life that's caused by lost and found and a brushstroke less carefully articulated, they unfreeze the figure. They bring life to it. So here you talk about realism, and then which realism, right? Just a fascinating question, isn't it? And then, by the way, I'm just the beginning of these thoughts. You'll want to have further thought about it. You read other things and look at many pictures. To my mind, realism takes the life, it brings an art of falseness to the thing that's what wasn't there in this. There's a certain expectation in Velasquez. And it's not that it's going to be the literal guy. It looks like it's going to be absolutely true. It looks like the modeling, the forms, the color, everything looks really beautifully true. And yet it doesn't make any effort to be the guy in that realist sense, in that literalist. Literalist might be a better word for what we're talking about here. Why did I throw this in? I must have had a good reason. Actually, this probably is a good one if you want to go back and forth between this one and the imaginative ones by Kramskoy. You'd have a fun idea of the huge difference in what their ideas are. And yet you'd find that every part of his paintings are noodled. They're noodled, but the goal isn't the same. And you'll have to look at these with your own eyes to see you can noodle this much and you're still not actually doing Trump, right? But here's what Velasquez was moving toward, and I would suggest to you that he was moving this way because of the lack of realism in the fixed in a movement in an area like this. He wanted to show passing light. He wanted to show something about life, right? And I think he was already in that mood, as I said, with the previous with the previous head. He's already in that place saying that, right? That's what he's telling me. He's showing you a live man. In and by the way, our discussion about truth, that's one of those things when you're talking about this thing, we've had it before here. You really want to weigh the balances. This is one of those places where you can see that both of these guys, Kramskoy and this guy, are both true. And so then what, right? Keep thinking. I mean, keep wondering. It's a delightful place. But here you can see the begin to be the disintegration of literal forms, and not that he misses them completely, but in some places he's minimizing it, and that's one of the things you're going to find about the way I think of painting is in the visual order is the order of those things. Visual is the order in which the articulation is clarified to the point of being like a realist would make it. I'm not helping myself by saying it the way I just did, but in some ways, I mean, I could mislead you, but nevertheless, there is in his work here, there's a certain element of realism. There's a lot of lostness and suggestiveness. And that gets you to a really fascinating discussion. I like that comment by C.S. Lewis, where he says he learned to write when he learned to suggest. And you wonder about that, right? So did we, I mean, it was all of the modeling, careful, fine stuff. I found some very funny things to look at. But I'm just doing this in passing. This is DeCamp. I'll show you there are some other pictures coming up that'll pick up on my thought there. This is Joseph DeCamp, and again, you can see it's not noodled. You don't have the same feeling when you get up close to it. You don't feel like you get to touch everything. You get to be in the picture, walking around in it. There's something very different. And yet it's true. I mean, these guys lived for the truth, the accuracy of the relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And they didn't like weak drawing and suggestive drawing that doesn't give the character of the form and all that sort of stuff is weak. It's not. No, none of these guys aimed at that. They all wanted. They had, you might say, an academic or even a realist value for truth in form, for example. But again, you're at this place where there's a lot of room for the suggested, and there's a good deal of life potentially lost by overdoing it. And does it become an exercise? That's really kind of an interesting question. Does it become an exercise in hard work? Just an essay in hard work, right? I don't mean to demean these, by the way, at all. This nice color scheme. And this guy actually, I should have pointed out in some of the other ones that he actually understands spotting and does beautiful spotting in a sort of Boston School way, shall we say? So even though he talks about deforming for the sake of realism, he says, I deform my composition. I don't precisely know what he means by that, but it's one of those thoughts because he's really aiming to make it somehow seem more real, like it's really there. And have you in the room with the saints or whoever it is, with Christ. And again, that's a bold difference there, right, between that articulation. You don't see a difference in accuracy, but you see a difference in choices. And so the aesthetic choices you have before you when you're painting are, among other things, do I noodle it up to the nth degree just for realism, or am I noodling it up because it's delivering on an aesthetic I have? Is realism, a question to me is always, is realism actually an aesthetic? Or is it an ambition or something like that? But that's the closest I'm going to get to I don't mean to be putting somebody down by saying that, but it's a fascinating question. So here again, you have Tarbell in the upper right, one of the beautiful portraits of all time, actually, in my view. And this stunning painting, you love these veil hats of Joseph DeCamp's sitter. Again, you'll see considerably more Velasquez in here than you will see a Kramskoy or something. These guys actually are younger by 20 or 30 years than Kramskoy. And the Rep and those guys, I think those were all born in like the 40s, and our guys are born like the 60s and the 1800s. And then here again, now you really do have that whole move farther away. Now doesn't all of this look true? And every once in a while you're talking about figures that look 8 heads high and things like that. Some of which actually is, I think, plausible caused by dresses and other kinds of things, but the look, the appearance, that's true. But you can see levels of articulate representation in lots of places in this picture, but it's very selective, and it seems to be primarily based on the presence and the expected busyness for that area. But yeah, but this is again that class of things that shows you now what do you feel like when you get into this one. You can see how a guy like Gamma would say when you're talking about people like this, that the subject of this kind of an impressionist becomes light. And I do recommend, by the way, that you look at the Barry Lyndon movie if you want to see some fascinating scenes, one after the other, just paintings from these times and so on. Fascinating movie. Look at that for these ideas of light in pictures. Guy did some amazing things. Very interesting story around it. Thank you, Mr. Producer, for introducing me to that. And I got to get this video off here. And I apologize to you guys. I don't mean to rush you, but I did. We're on a crunch today a little bit, and I got behind. Another sergeant, much the same thing. You can see that his idea is not to put you into the room so you can crawl around and turn over all this trinkets on the shelves in the background. Or study up the character of the person in the portraits. You can see what it is. And this is classic, in my view now, this is classic realism, classic representational painting, as this representation to the degree needed with the higher motive of the beauty of the rectangle. So, and again, I won't tell you that Kramskoy didn't have that same ambition, that same training for sure. The Russian Imperial Academy was great training, it looks like, at that time. But I wanted to show you this. This is my really most horrible thing I could probably do to you guys. I think this is my last video too. But here I am showing you a scene from a movie called The Alamo. It's a John Wayne movie. And you can see that the guy has set up people in the room and put separate lighting on each of these people, trying to create this scene. But I want to suggest to you that I get almost the same feeling from those early Kramskoy ones as I do from this movie photograph. And I find this very difficult to look at. All you can think is that model, this actor, they've got the hands up, they're holding their places, the lights are lit like this. But in this painting, it's the entire thing you can see is organized around the flamenco, around the idea of this wild dance or strong dance, however you want to think of that. And the El Jalejo is what the one by Sargent's called. You can see it at the Gardner Museum. But maybe I'll just end with that. But so which is the realism? I mean, and if this is the realism, then I think I'd rather have this. But if you're talking about and this is a big deal. I mean, we're talking about the question of, are we talking about literalism versus plausibilism, right? But the truth is, let's say the fact of truth in Sargent's work is no less than this. The proportions, all of it looks true. But it isn't noodled up into being that model. So he's not a slave of the model, right? Again, this is an imaginative painting by Sargent. For you who haven't seen it, there's a nice little booklet on the subject showing a bunch of the sketches. And now with that, I better go. I've got to get this off to my producer really fast. Again, I'd be intrigued by any other discussion that you might have and challenges on the question of realism. I'm just beginning to even review it all myself again, based on some struggles with what certain organizations are doing these days, promoting what I'd call photographic realism. I don't think it's meaning to be photorealism, but it so borders on the photographic that it's losing its place in the world of painting. And the question winds up being, is the aesthetic the thing, or is the realism the thing, and is there truly a break? Is there some break? Is there some place where they don't meet? And I keep finding that there truly is. So now you've seen what my first review of realism looks like. So go and enjoy life, enjoy the real world. I prefer to think of it as the representation in our world. In the painting, in the Impressionist painting, the stuff I was just showing you, like these guys here, they set up these things and the beauty of these things, and then the framing of them to get them in the right places, and then the articulation and the focus on the thing that makes this magic, and then leaving, is all based on, that's a long model, right? Painting from life. Portrait painters all did it. But it's also, this is the world, though, based on the world of appearances. So is realism, is that appearances? You're looking with your eyes, you're drawing what you see. But there's a difference, isn't there, in the final handling when you work from the appearances. and especially in the fact that the appearances work from strong and significant effects and diminish. And as the lesser effects are not worked on, painters more and more see that they're most unneeded. It's a hugely helpful device, if you want to call it that, or method for limiting unnecessary work. But that's to put them in the same camp, and they're not in the same camp. All right. So I'm out of town before I get shot. All right. See you guys next week, and in 3 weeks, we are doing on this day, on Sunday. I think it's in 3 weeks exactly, and I'm hoping Mr. Producer will put that up. We're going to see you again live and follow up with that demonstration. So if you haven't seen that, go look at it so you're ready for the next view of it. And I'm going to continue chatting about it. I think I'm going to change my method. I think I'm going to talk over myself more completely. I had you sort of listening to me in a room, and I thought that gave a certain kind of, you could be in the room with us moment, but I think it probably can do better work for you in terms of talking about our way of working by just talking about what I'm doing as it goes by. So, all right, with that in mind, I'm out of here. See you next time.